So definitely as we're going through this, if you have questions from things you've been studying, study guides, things like that, you can even post them in the meeting chat at any time throughout the class. So I'm going to make sure also that students are coming to this meeting rather than the other meeting. So give me just a second to make sure that's clear for everyone. All right, so hopefully that's not too confusing for students to see the post stream and then this. It looks, I suspect I'll have all the access to this meeting that I'll need for today. So let's get going. All right, so a quick review of where we are. This is April 29th. We're almost to May. Makes me think of, what is that? Is that a Backstreet Boys song or an NSYNC song? Someone comment which one it is. I don't feel like enough of a 90s kid since I forgot that now. Now I feel really bad, and it's stuck in my head. Anyway, we're going to finish up with chapter 17 and review for our final exam. If you have any questions also about your question papers, I've gotten a couple emails, specific things like when you said this in your feedback, what exactly did you mean? Can you point to anything specific to change for my second question paper? As a reminder, the second question paper is an entirely new question paper. So this is not a revised draft of your first. It is a completely new question, a completely new topic. It could be connected to your first one, but hopefully the question is coming from the second half of the class, so something we've touched on in the second half. So that's the question paper. It is due tomorrow night. Signature assignment, reflection paper, NSYNC. Thank you. Now I'll have to listen to that part of the song, maybe not the whole song, later today, or maybe tomorrow, right before it turns to May. Anyway, so thank you though. Also, signature assignment, reflection paper. If you're having any trouble with that, let me know. Reflection paper again is just a one-page reflection. I've got some prompts in the instructions to reflect on, and the signature assignment is one of the assignments you've done in class, so probably a question paper that you think shows your work in the class, things you've learned, and then also include your link to your ePortfolio. I know a few students were having trouble uploading 2 documents, but it should be allowing you to upload 2 documents, so let me know if that's the case, and you can always email me those documents, or as long as you can put your ePortfolio link, and then I can see both those documents in your ePortfolio, that would be fine too. With that, make sure that your ePortfolio is set to public rather than private. Even if I'm logged in into like the ePortfolio system with my login, I'm not always able to see students' ePortfolios because of the settings. And usually by that time when I'm grading them, it's like May 5th, so students are done with classes. They're not checking emails. So before, as you turn it in, check your privacy settings on your ePortfolio to make sure it is set so that I should be able to see it. That would be great. All right, and then the exam is coming up, and we'll talk about that as we talk about the study guide. So let's jump back into the stages of death and dying. Last time we just mentioned really briefly that you've probably heard of these stages of grief. So originally, Kubler-Ross investigated these as stages that people had and experienced. Oh, the signature assignment and reflection paper, do you turn those in on Canvas as well? Yeah, here I can actually go to Canvas and show you. Oh, I haven't logged in yet. Let's do that first. Probably because it's been sitting there, it's not happy. but I'll show you on Canvas where you can log in. And submit everything. All right, so let's go to our class here. So for your signature assignment and reflection paper, all the way down here, this is where you turn it in. There are some instructions here, but this is actually where you turn it in. It should show the point value. I can probably change to student view and make it look a little more similar to what you will see. So let's do that. So here in Unit 4, signature assignment reflection paper, click on that to submit. As you click on this, you can, hopefully you've already read the instructions, you've gone through, let's say you've already completed it. You're ready to turn it in. So here you can click upload file, then add another file. So one of those files should be the signature assignment. So your question paper, you don't need to rename it anything different, just submit that as one of the files. Then the other file, have it be, say, your name, reflection paper, class 403, spring 2021, something like that. So it's clear that it's yours. So just add those two files with these buttons. So upload file, add another file. Then in the comments, include the link. So this would be your link to ePortfolio. So you've got those two files, you've got the link pasted in here, and then you click submit assignment. So that is how to get all of those onto Canvas. Again, if for some reason it's only letting you upload one file, make it your reflection paper, and then make sure on your ePortfolio I can see both the documents. So really, in some ways, the link here is one of the most important, especially if you can't get the documents in here. So make sure you've got those two documents and then the link, but at the very least, the link is kind of the most important piece of that. So questions about that, on how to turn that all in on Canvas? Did that make it more clear for everyone, I hope? Feel free to take over the mic and ask questions too. Okay, glad it cleared it up for you. Then hopefully other students who might have been a little unclear are a lot more clear on how to turn that in now. All right, so let's jump into talking about these stages of death. So again, it was first investigated as people were dying in, say, hospice care or at the end of their life in different care settings. And they saw, Kubler-Ross saw that these stages were kind of a pattern as they interviewed participants who were getting closer or further away from dying, who knew that they were dying. They went through their description. So essentially they would interview people at multiple points along the stages or through the end of their lifespan. And they saw that a big pattern emerged, that many of them first went through denial and isolation, which hopefully you've read in your book. We'll look at these in a little more detail, but hopefully you remember these definitions. So they went through denial and isolation, then they went through a phase of anger, they went through a phase of bargaining, depression, acceptance. And so even originally, they saw that some of these might be shorter for some than others. But the initial research that came out was that in the stages of dying, this was the pattern. You did denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So after that, through later research, through using additional methods, they found that, well, it didn't actually always go that way. Some people would have denial and then jump straight to acceptance. Some people would go straight to acceptance. Some people would have some bargaining and then some anger, or maybe start with acceptance, but then get depressed and then get angry. So basically, it wasn't always a linear trajectory. And later researchers also applied this not only to the process of death, but for the process of grieving for those people around the death. So grieving the loss of a family member, something like that. Then even later researchers applied that grief structure and this model to other forms of grief. So it could include losing a partner, well, I guess losing a partner, a breakup is what I'm trying to get at. The word just wouldn't come to my mind. So a breakup, grief about, I mean, maybe this one sounds silly, but it could be anything. So grief about a motorcycle that's wrecked. So my motorcycle's not wrecked, in case anybody was wondering. It's doing just fine, sitting in the garage. So let's talk a little bit about the definitions of these phases, and then we will talk about some of this research originally and then where it's come from then. So anger, with this, denial, especially in the original research, gives way to this kind of anger, resentment, envy. Might be angry at the body, it might be angry at deity, it might be just angry about life in general. So that anger could be focused any one different way. It was pretty varied on how people felt angry or where that anger was directed to, sometimes themselves as well. So bargaining, developing hope that death can be postponed, whether that's a bargaining in and of themselves, like, hey, if I do X, Y, and Z, I will be able to survive longer. So kind of their own bargaining with themselves. Sometimes this might be a deity. Oftentimes in, say, a movie, we see this bargaining phase, like bargaining with their god, saying, like with a prayer or something, saying, hey, I'll do X, Y, Z if I don't die. But this doesn't have to be with a deity as well. So the bargaining can also be directly done with, say, a healthcare provider. That's a little more rare, but depression, we've talked about depression before, so we don't really need to define that one. With this, acceptance is more like a sense of peace and accepting that certainty of death as you get to that phase. So with this, like I said, Kubler-Ross talked about how these were the stages that people went through, but more recent research has found that, well, it doesn't have to go in that line. It sometimes jumps around. Some people don't hit all of these, and grief is, well, the process of dying as well as the process of grief is really individual, and it's okay. The way people do it, it's okay. If they're grieving their own death, if they're going through anger and that's what they feel the entire time, that's okay. If we're accepting it, but now they're not anymore, that's okay too. So let's watch a little video with a little more detail on some more recent research. It'll talk about some of the previous research, and then we will talk about it.
There are a lot of ways to mark the passing of a loved one, but in many modern cultures, once the funeral's over, all that's left are too many flowers and that well-meant soggy casserole your neighbor made for you. Those black mourning dresses that Scarlett O'Hara hated so much have gone out of style. But grief doesn't stop just because the public ceremony of saying goodbye is over. Grief can be hard and lonely, and sometimes it can feel like it'll never end. Psychologists have been trying to figure this out for over a century. And the only good answers they've got are that it's a totally normal process and that it's different for everyone. Bereavement is the technical term that psychologists use to talk about the loss of a loved one by death. Grief is what they call the distress caused by that loss. And when you think about grief in a psychological sense, the first thing that probably comes to mind is the Kubler-Ross model. You might not recognize that name, but it gets talked about a lot in pop culture. You might, for instance, know it from that robot chicken video of a giraffe stuck in quicksand. Basically, the Kubler-Ross model says that we all go through 5 stages as we process our grief. We start off by denying that whatever happened is real, which helps us temporarily deal with it. Next, we get angry, and then we try to bargain our way out of it by making a deal with God or the universe or whatever we believe has the power to change what has happened. When that doesn't work, we experience depression. And finally, we get to acceptance. Everything might not be okay, but we've learned to live with it. Even if you haven't taken a psychology class, you're probably familiar with this idea. But you might not know where the model comes from. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a psychiatrist who worked with terminally ill patients. She helped change attitudes about dying and encouraged people to actually talk about death. And rather than just worrying about the salvation of the soul, she was a strong supporter of hospice care, which focuses on making the patient's final days comfortable and keeping them involved in the decisions that affect them. This is all super important stuff that has affected how we think about people who are dying. But she also wrote a book called On Death and Dying. Published in 1969, it was based on interviews with over 200 dying patients. Kubler-Ross was influenced by the work of two psychiatrists who proposed that after a separation or loss, grief was a process that involved 4 sequential stages.
So I know this is a little bit tangential to what we've been talking about, but especially since this is the last class, we're kind of reviewing how the field works, some of the theories that we've touched on many times. I think this is a good point to end on, or not end the whole video on. But this is a really good example of a little bit of a taste of the research that Kubler-Ross had, that there were already some psychiatrists who thought there was a stage model to grief. So Kubler-Ross might have had that in their mind and maybe even was specifically testing for that with interviews and qualitative studies. You can't necessarily test for something, but also methods weren't as good back then as well. So they might have already had that in the back of their mind as they went and they tested or were investigating grief and found additional stages or delineated it in a different way. This is often a way that theories change over time, is that we have, say, this 4 sequential stages theory, and then Kubler-Ross says, well, actually with this evidence across all these patients, it looks like maybe these additional stages, and this is the linear pattern that patients go through. And so others will do research on those things and say, okay, yes, this 5-stage model. So that idea of having stages of grief already existed, but now it's become a little more specific. Oftentimes, this is how theories change. So the description of the general process of grief is the theory, so that big, broad, overarching idea. And so it's now updated because of new data to be more incorporative of the new data. So, and then since then, more updates have happened that we see, okay, these are the kind of outcomes. It's not necessarily stages that you're going through, but these are possible outcomes that are common for people to experience. So you can see kind of that, hopefully you can see with these couple examples, how these theories around the processing of grief have changed over time, how new evidence modifies the theory. Oftentimes, theories like that get modified, and then in the end, they might be very completely different than what they started out as. So if you looked at the ideas around grief today compared to these original 2 psychiatrists' ideas, you would say they're probably very completely different. And so the theory has now completely changed, but it's more of a gradual linear process. It's not often, as we talked about in the beginning, even though you might be falsifying data, it's usually not just one study, but a whole system of studies to build up enough evidence to say, hey, this new model or this new theory explains it a lot better than how we explained it before. So hopefully that's a lot more clear to you now at the end of class versus our examples at the beginning of class around falsification. We used examples of spontaneous generation and that theory at the beginning of class. So hopefully you can remember those things. If not, maybe review your notes and compare what you know about theories and how they change over time to what you were thinking at the beginning. So a little tangential. I wasn't actually intending to talk about that, but I think it's really relevant here at the end of class to tie things together.
The process that involved 4 sequential stages. So in her book, she proposed 5 stages we all go through as we come to terms with dying. Not while grieving for someone else, but while dying ourselves. The book sold really well, and the 5 stages took off in the public's imagination. People started applying the stages to grief, even though they weren't meant to describe it. And so Kubler-Ross and her co-author eventually went back and adapted the same 5 stages so that they made sense for grieving too. But there wasn't really any scientific basis for that adaptation. Of course, we didn't always think of grieving as a pattern of psychological responses. Since death is inevitable, people have been studying grief for a while. In the 17th century, it was believed that too much grieving could be deadly. And in the 19th century, Charles Darwin wrote about grief and noted that monkeys and apes also seemed capable of feeling it. Freud had something to say about it too. In 1917, he proposed that the living had to detach their emotional energy from the dead person and channel it into some other aspect of their lives. He called this grief work. And if people didn't do grief work, he believed they had a much higher risk of developing a psychological illness because of their supposedly pathological grief. Yeah, Freud had a lot of ideas, and they weren't always great. But of all these ideas, the Kubler-Ross model is the one that really stuck around. Some psychologists think that its staying power comes from the fact that it's such a good narrative. Our brains like to organize things, and this model offers a nice, neat progression through 5 well-defined stages. And ultimately has a happy ending. But even though we might like the way it sounds, psychologists nowadays have a few big issues with these 5 stages.
So I think this also ties back into one thing we've talked about before is disseminating our research. So as it talked about, the book that Kubler-Ross wrote sold really well. So clearly it was written in a way that people were understanding, that they could pick up and read, versus a lot of the research articles that you're learning how to kind of dive into and dissect. They are probably still fairly inaccessible to you at your stage in your learning about psychology. So with that, this really goes to show how much better psychology can do to share the research that we have with people. Hopefully in doing your work for your question papers, you've also found like blogs or websites from maybe the APA or researchers or things like that, reputable resources that do a better job at explaining research at a level just anyone can understand. Generally, we try to hit like beginning of high school reading levels kind of understanding when we're kind of trying to disseminate to everybody. And so hopefully you've seen that some people have done a good job at that and some people have done a really bad job at that. When you do a better job, it's easier for people to understand the research. It's easier for them to apply it to their lives. Sometimes they are going to take it and apply it in really strange ways that you didn't intend them to. And so there's a question there, like how much are you responsible for people misinterpreting that? But yeah, this is a big piece of psychology as a whole. If something gets into the public consciousness, if they understand an aspect of psychology, people are going to take and run with it. So yeah, that goes into the issues of disseminating information to people in general, not just to scientists. So.
First of all, there's a lack of empirical evidence. Many researchers argue that the interviews it's based on weren't conducted with enough scientific rigor. In the years since the book was published, some studies have attempted to replicate and verify the findings. For instance, one study published in 2007 followed 233 people over 3 years, and a 2010 study looked at 614 undergraduates and surveyed them once, all at different points in their grief. Both studies asked the subjects to assess their grief on a scale for disbelief, yearning, anger, depression, and acceptance, and they all had mixed results. The 2007 study found that acceptance was the most common reaction, even right after death. But after averaging all the data over time, the different stages did peak in the order that Kubler-Ross had suggested. The 2010 study found that their results didn't support Kubler-Ross's stage theory, but they didn't completely disprove it either. And how much people were thinking about the loss seemed to influence what they were experiencing more than the passing of time. A second criticism is that the stages don't really have an underlying explanation. There's no hypothesis for why grief would be organized into sequential stages, what function they serve, or how people move from one stage to the next. On top of that, the stages are kind of random, psychologically speaking. Some of them are emotional states like anger and depression, while others are cognitive processes like acceptance and denial. And lastly, researchers have noticed that the Kubler-Ross model seems to create problematic expectations for how grief should be dealt with. The 5 stages can make people expect to experience certain things in a certain order. And if they don't do that, or they don't hit certain stages at all, people might believe that they aren't coping properly. That expectation could also lead to unhelpful support from their social networks or healthcare professionals. But psychologists aren't just critiquing the Kubler-Ross model. They're also trying to figure out new ways to think about grief. There's a ton of research to sift through, but there are a few prominent ideas. The dual process model of grief was proposed in 1999. Developed from other studies on cognitive stress, it suggests that the griever switches back and forth between two patterns of behavior, called orientations. In the loss orientation, someone spends time thinking about the person they've lost and what life used to be like. They might look at old pictures or tell stories, and they'll express a lot of emotion about the loss. In the restoration orientation, someone focuses on the changes that need to be made. It's more of a problem-solving state of mind. They might work on establishing a new identity for themselves or adjusting to do things that the deceased used to do, like doing the dishes after you cooked. What's unique about the dual process model is that it suggests that a person who's grieving switches back and forth between these two orientations until eventually they don't need to think about certain aspects of loss anymore. It's a more flexible model with room for individual and cultural differences. One of the best known task-based models of grief was proposed in 2008 by a clinical psychologist with a lot of experience treating people dealing with grief. While this one also doesn't have a ton of empirical evidence, unlike stage-based models, it tries to account more for people going through grief differently. The model says that grieving is a process of engaging in 4 tasks, all in no particular order. Essentially, they include accepting the reality of the loss, processing the pain of the grief, adjusting to the world without the loved one, and finding a lasting connection with them somehow. The task-based model also points out 7 factors that can affect the individual experience of each griever, which may help healthcare professionals understand what someone's going.
So with this, hopefully you're seeing now and being able to connect this to the overarching how grief and the theories around grief are changing. So here we've got a couple different alternative models that are being tested, that are being thought about. So, and who knows, one of these two, or maybe a combination of these two, or maybe this one might win out in the end of being the best way to explain the process of grieving and the data that we have. So for a new theory to take up the place of the old one, it needs to explain everything that came before better or the same, and then explain the new data that we have better than the previous one did as well. So if you look at these 7 pieces, they're basically correlated in different ways to those 4 tasks. So I would think of it as, say, a model. I would have these 7 things. I've only got 5 fingers, so limitation there, but going to one of those 4 things. So on a model, you would have these 7 things, and you'd have some arrows pointing to maybe a circle. If you're doing, say, a structural equation model, that reference probably doesn't matter at all for you students. Basically a visual model that these things all are correlated to those 4 tasks. Some of them might be more or less correlated to certain tasks out of those 4. And so researching those connections, researching these pieces, having a therapist who knows your previous experience with the death, knows about your personality, social factors, those kinds of things can help. So who knows, maybe this one will be more predictive, a better description. So while we are talking about grief and the process of grief and the research around that, hopefully you're also seeing those connections to how theories change over time as well.
These factors are things like their relationship to the deceased, how the person died, or other stress that they're under. Another prominent way of thinking about grief identifies multiple possible grieving processes, reinforcing that it can be very different for different people. This idea started with a 2002 study on 205 people who processes, reinforcing that it can be very different for different people.
So that's the main point I want to end on. I've kind of gone on too many tangents through this video, so I don't think we'll finish it right now. But feel free to watch the rest of it because it is good information. But I think we've got some of the main points that I wanted to get out there. And the main thing is that grief can be very different for different people. So a primary thing or a primary recommendation that grief researchers or psychologists or psychiatrists will share is to essentially allow people to grieve. So if they're self-harming, obviously that's not a healthy way to grieve. But other than that, there's a lot of ways that might look different than the stage model, the Kubler-Ross stage model. They never get to acceptance, that's okay too. If they're angry for a long time, try to have some understanding and empathy of that. Don't try to, kind of what they were pointing at, the stage model kind of suggests that this is what people should go through. So to try and get a person to acceptance, we shouldn't try to do that. We should help people be in their grief and let them go through it on their own, with support from people around them is some of the big things. And it can be very different. So two family members grieving the death of a parent or another family member might go through very different grieving processes. It doesn't mean that one is better than another. If they're doing unhealthy behaviors, obviously that should be taken care of and helped with. So hopefully those points are clear, and it's definitely relevant to some of these other things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about things to do for the person who is dying, as well as things to do for the family, or things that the family should do for the person who is dying. So it kind of jumps back and forth for recommendations about the dying process here. So perceived control, we talked about how perceived control could have a cognitive factor and self-efficacy factor that helps people have longer lives. So it's an adaptive strategy for being alert and cheerful. If you have more control over your environment as a person who is even dying, you will be more alert, more cheerful. You'll have more self-efficacy, probably more self-esteem if you are able to do things or feel like you can do things for yourself in an environment. So denial does help people to avoid coping with the intense feelings of anger or hurt. So it's not a bad reaction. So we might feel like denial and anger are sometimes considered not as good ways to process grief, but they can be adaptive, they can be helpful. So it's not our job to try and get people out of those phases of grief. So with that, it can be maladaptive. So if you don't accept, say, a life-saving operation because you're in denial, so if you need a surgery and you're in complete denial that you're going to need that surgery and you don't get it, that's obviously maladaptive. Other things with the grieving processes, again, if you're self-harming or something like that, that's maladaptive as well. So with this, more than 80% of Americans die in hospitals and about 20% die in nursing homes. So again, we talked about in the previous class that hospitals' goal is generally to extend life. So to fix whatever's wrong, heal diseases, extend life as long as possible. Versus a nursing home, their goal is going to be a little different, especially if they're doing something like hospice care. And you can get hospice care in hospitals as well. So hospitals do have professional staff members, technology to prolong life. They can do a really good job at that, probably better than nursing homes in general. Versus nursing homes. The point here is choose which kind of place, if it's possible, to choose which kind of place you would like to die. So if that is something that you're capable of, maybe in an advanced directive, having that written down. So with this, communicating with a dying person, this is one of those points of something from a person who's experiencing the death of, say, a family member or partner or something like that. So with this, it's important to communicate with them, and it's got some tips on how to do that, because it lets them have their own, let them share their own ideas about dying. So communicating, that's a two-way street, right? You're talking, they're speaking as well. As much as they can, depending on what it is. So you might be able to help them complete plans, projects, or make arrangements and decisions. So maybe in that dying process, whether it's a few days, a few months, a few years, things like that, being able to communicate with that person can help them do things, even if it's just something as simple as calling their sibling or calling their child or something like that. So it gives them the opportunity to reminisce. So that's a thing that humans do a lot, especially near the end of life. We're looking back at our identity, looking back at things that we've done. That can be a positive thing. And then it can help them have a better understanding, especially if they're confused about what's going on, explaining to them the processes. So really clearly explaining like what they can expect their body to do, capacities they might lose. Might not be a fun conversation depending on what you're talking about. I remember a family that I knew that the grandma or the mother was suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, which is just awful. Anyway, at the beginning, cognitively and through the process of the disease, essentially your cognitive faculties are there, explaining to them that, hey, first you're going to lose mobility, then you're going to lose the ability to speak, you're going to not even be able to sit up. And that whole process, like, that's not necessarily a fun conversation, but it helps people understand. So there's maybe a little less fear when noticing those things happen. How to communicate with a dying person is an important thing. It's maybe not something a lot of us have experience with. Maybe we, at early stages of our life, maybe we only have very few people that we experience dying. But be with the person, establish your presence. Let's say you come into a hospital room, let the person know you're there, knock, say hi, let them know. Speak at eye level. So make sure they can see you. You're not towering over them. Come to their level. Don't be afraid to touch them. I mean, obviously with people who maybe have an infectious disease or something like COVID, this isn't necessarily possible. But a lot of people who are dying are often starved for human affection. So with that, holding their hand, things like that, can be very appropriate if that's something that they would want. So you can ask them. You can ask them if they would like that, or if they would like a hug, because in many cases they might, and people might be avoiding them. They don't want to maybe get sick. And you can ask doctors as well if it would be safe to do that. But that can be very helpful for the person. Eliminate distractions. So you come into the room, announce yourself, ask if they want to talk, turn off the TV, ignore your phone, put it on silent, be present in that moment. So with this, plan your visit to be short, especially if they're frail. You might not have much time to speak to them, so expect that. And then don't insist that they accept their death or deny it. So don't try to move them to any other stages of grief in that process. Let them experience it on their own. Support them in what they're going through. So hopefully these tips are helpful for you as you experience people who are dying in your life. So allow them to express that anger or guilt or acceptance or feelings or of pride or sadness in their lives. So discuss the outcomes and treatments. So what are they doing? What is their next operation going to be like? Anything that they need to do still? Are there papers they still have to sign? So do they need you to cancel their cell phone service? Things like that. If they want you to contact someone or deliver a message, let them reminisce. So again, this might be short depending on the person, but this is one thing you could encourage them to do. Talk about things that memories you have together, things that they liked about their life, things they remember about you. These can all be really nice and helpful for a person in the process of dying. So with this, make an appointment if you can. So obviously if it's a hospital, they probably have specific visiting hours, or a nursing home has specific hours where you can visit. If it's possible, make an appointment so they know to expect you. That's a good way to announce yourself as well. And then express your regard. So don't be afraid to express love. Don't be afraid to say goodbye. Yeah. All right. So hopefully those give you some good tips. This is some of, I think, the most important pieces is about the stages of grief and how to communicate with a dying person that we cover in this chapter. So we're kind of going to speed through some of the rest of this so we can jump to our study guide for exam 4. So, another thing that I want to talk about is when grief can be maladaptive. So some aspects of maladaptive grief. So disenfranchised grief, this is when an individual's grief of a dead person is socially ambiguous. So it's something that they can't necessarily openly mourn or be supported in. So oftentimes this happens if, say, an ex-spouse dies. Many people might not understand grieving that loss, or having an abortion, or having a miscarriage, or a stigmatized death due to something like AIDS. So if they feel like, if some others outside feel like a person deserved it, or you shouldn't feel bad about that person, this is what I mean by disenfranchised grief. When a person is grieving something that other people in society might not say, hey, that's an appropriate thing to grieve about. That can be really tough. because they might not necessarily feel like they can publicly acknowledge it, and that can lead to a harder time processing that grief. So with this, death's impacts on survivors strongly influenced by death circumstances. So if there's a year to plan the death, and through that process to communicate with that person, to say goodbye, on average, it's going to, the survivor's emotions around it will tend to be a little more positive than if it's a sudden thing like a car accident, or say an aneurysm or something, when it wasn't expected at all. So generally sudden deaths have more intense and prolonged effects on survivors. So survivors of whatever it might be often develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So getting support for that is very important. So that can have symptoms like sleep problems, flashbacks, nightmares, concentration problems. So something to definitely get treated. Child deaths can be extremely difficult for parents as well. So some of these same kinds of symptoms as well. So humans, we've talked about this before, humans are meaning-making machines. We really try to make meaning and find meaning in things that we're doing. So oftentimes we try to do that with our sense of the world after a loss. So whether it's a loss of, say, a loved one or something like that. So with this, reliving the events of death is really common. There's an effort to make sense of why it happened or what it was that happened, whether that's understanding the specific medical factors that led to death. If it's a disaster or an accident, trying to make sense of that. So ways that we can make meaning is one, through sense making. So explanations of the death can be really clinical or medical, looking at the decisions that the person made or the doctors make. So trying to make sense of how XYZ happened. Benefit finding, seeing if you can find possible positive consequences. A really common one is people saying they're no longer in pain anymore. So that's a really clear example of benefit finding. So they're not in pain anymore, so that's a benefit to them. Continuing bonds, so having communities come together, creating bonds around and sharing memories of a person, photos. This often happens in, say, like a funeral type of setting as well. And then identity reconstruction. So especially if you're losing a child or a partner, part of your identity might have been tied up in that relationship. And so this is another example of when identity might change for a person so that they adjust it to this new situation that they're in. So with this, there's often profound grief for an intimate partner as well. Widows outnumber widowers because women do tend to live longer than men, so their partners might have died before them. So with this, about 14% of age 65 to 74 are widows, 31% 75 to 84, and then 59% of 85 and over. So definitely suggests that maybe there should be additional supports for widows in some ways. So community supports, for example, if this is something that's not available in the community, a group, things like that. So with this, widowed women tend to be the poorest group in America as well. So if you add that on to additional risk factors, so ethnicity or other socioeconomic status variables, that can be a really challenging situation to be in. So basically the point here is depression peaks in the first year after a loss. This isn't just for widowhood, even though this fact is here. It's not uncommon to have really severe symptoms of depression for, say, around 9 months to a year after a loss. And then I think we've got some information on when that grief extends longer. I hope I left that in here. So funerals can be a really important way to process mourning. It allows us to get together with community, share memories, do some of this, these things that can help through the grieving process. So in some cultures, ceremonial meals are shared. There's very different rules and very different rituals for death in many different cultures. All right, so did I take it out? Or was that in another lifespan development book? I guess it's not in here. That's too bad. So essentially, I wanted to make some points about depression and how it's similar to this disenfranchised grief, but depression is not uncommon for people who are grieving. If it's leading to the difficulties in day-to-day life, if say after 9 months or a year of losing someone, you're still not able to do things like getting to work or doing day-to-day tasks, definitely seeking help would be essential in that kind of case. So it probably been good to do that beforehand, but especially if you see someone who's been grieving for 9 months to a year, if they're still not able to get into normal day-to-day cycles like taking care of themselves and doing things like work and daily tasks, get them support would be something to watch out for. Yeah. All right, so it's always funny to have a lifespan development class because we talk about so many positive aspects of the lifespan and helping people thrive, and then we always end on death and dying and grieving, which seems like a real downer. But it is a process of life as well. There at the end of life, and we definitely do need to be considerate of the dying person as well as how grief happens. So let's review a couple quick things before we jump into the study guide, and definitely this would be a great time to put any questions that you have from your studying up to this point about any of the concepts that we've covered in class. So put them in the meeting chat, put them in, actually what time are we at? Okay, good. We do have enough time to go over the study guide. So lifespan perspective, we started at the, actually before this point, we started in prenatal development, and we've gone all the way through from early childhood, middle childhood, late childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood, and death and dying. So we have talked about development and the patterns of change that happen throughout time. So you can see some things like identity development do stay fairly consistent, that we maybe around 14 to 21 settle on an identity for a first time, and then we reorganize that throughout the rest of our lifespan. We can see attachment is one of those things that tends to stay pretty consistent, but might not always. So hopefully you can look at the patterns that we've talked about, and then we kind of chunk them up into age groups versus talking about cognitive development all the way through. So in some ways, I would like to try this class when we look at maybe one specific topic like that, like cognitive development, and follow it all the way through, like working memory all the way through. But hopefully you can look back at your notes and kind of do that on your own, looking at those different features, whether it's physical development, cognitive development, personality, things like that, and how it changes all the way over time, and look at those patterns. And hopefully you have a better understanding of development over time. So development being multidimensional. This has been a key point throughout this class. So multidimensional, we've got biology, we've got cognition, we've got socio-emotional. That's what our chapter's focused on. But we've also talked about things like temperament and aspects of cognition and neurology as different dimensions that can affect the development. So the neurology of your myelin in your brain, so that it's been a while since we've mentioned this one, that it's not till you're about 23 or so that the myelin is all finished up into your prefrontal cortex. So that gives you a lot better ability to think and process faster and regulate your emotions better than at, say, 14, when that emotion center of the brain gets all wired up, or around 14. Multidirectional. So we've talked about things that are growing or declining at different times in life, things that can still be, even at the end of life, increased. So there's multiple dimensions that we can grow and decrease capacities naturally, and then with support or with help, we can develop in different directions. Plasticity. So one of the main points here is neurology, and that the brain, the neurons themselves, can make new connections rather quickly, that we can learn new skills, our brain can reorganize to do things, and that cognitively we can keep capacities for a long time, even if we have something like a debilitating illness like dementia or Alzheimer's, which might be affecting neurons. We can still use that brain plasticity to support and maintain capacities, or even grow and build capacities. As well as the fact that, say, in early childhood, language is easier to learn. Your brain is prepped and primed, has evolved to learn it at that point. Makes it harder later in life, but it's still plastic enough to do so. Multidisciplinary, we've talked about research from medicine, from neurology, from evolutionary psychologists, from sociologists. So hopefully you can see a little bit better a lot of these disciplines that come together. Some of you in your question papers, you have one of your research articles that comes from medical research, and then the other one from a psychology journal. So hopefully you're seeing this multidisciplinariness, that we need to all work together in understanding these kinds of things. I don't know that I've seen any question papers with anthropology sources this semester, but I have in the past. I might be forgetting right now. So development is contextual. Hopefully you understand that term now. That context is the settings that you're in, so your family context, school context. Hopefully I don't need to hammer that into your brain anymore. So development is so many things, and hopefully it's been exciting to learn about through this class. Hopefully you've been able to take some things away of tips of things to improve life for other people, for yourself, because it is really relevant to application in day-to-day life. So our tips today on how to speak to a person who is dying, that's applied research, like which kinds of ways to communicate have the best outcomes. So it's because researchers have gone in and tested different ways that people are communicating, observing it, seeing the outcomes of it, which ways people communicate, does it look like are better or worse? So empirical research is behind all of these things. All right, hopefully you've got a good taste of a little bit of these different pieces: education, human thriving. I often focus on human thriving in the conversation: social policy, culture and diversity, technology, health and well-being, parenting. Hopefully you've seen some of these applied focuses and topics that we touch on. Hopefully now when you look at this model of Bronfenbrenner or Lerner's developmental systems theories, they're a little more clear. You kind of understand them. So if you go out of this class, you realize, oh, hey, researchers are using developmental systems theories, and you have a little bit of an understanding of what that means versus are using Piaget's cognitive developmental stages. So hopefully you understand what the field is doing a little better now. All right, so this is the model I showed you near the beginning of class, and we kind of briefly went over it when talking about applied research. So you've got a social problem. Maybe it's that there are very many widows and maybe not enough supports. So you do applied research to solve that problem. With that, you get out in the real world, people who are already working on it, you collaborate with them, you do research methods, you build your theories, you test things. Once you have your findings, you disseminate that. You disseminate it to research journals, you change policies, you do evaluations, you write books or share blogs for these kinds of practitioners, and then hopefully through that cycle you solve problems. Hopefully you can see how that can be done, how developmental research can be a part of that process in humans' day-to-day lives, because it is one of the more applied, I guess all of psychology can be very applied. Yeah, it's a very applied science. So developmental cascades, hopefully when I show these, there's a lot of things that come to your mind. Neurons, hopefully when I show this picture of a neuron, you have a sense of what this is. You don't even necessarily have to review it. It's just in your mind. That's what I'm hoping. So that is the end of these lecture slides. So is there anything that we've covered right then or that you've been studying that you'd want to go over really quickly before we jump into the study guide? My tea is cold now. I didn't have time to grab my thermos. Still tastes good though. All right, well then we can just jump straight into the study guide. All right, so does anyone have specific questions? Let's zoom in, make this a little bit bigger. That's probably good. All right, so hopefully that is big enough and clear enough that you can see it on your screens as we're going through this lecture. All right, what questions do you have around the study guide? If there's no specific questions, what I think we will do is basically just go through it question by question, and I'll kind of just say, hey, number one, what's the answer? You can put it in the chat box, and then we will see. But if there's one that you've been working on and you're a little confused and you want to get it out there first, let me know. All right, so let's just go one by one. So I'm not going to read maybe some of these shorter ones, like number 3 I might read, but go ahead and read number 1. Again, this study guide, I've mostly just put in question examples that you'll see. We've been covering these topics. A lot of the topics in Unit 4 do kind of repeat from middle adulthood, just because the research is lower from middle and late adulthood. So I don't have any of those general points, but each of these questions touches on some of those general points. So go for it. Number 1, what do you think the answer is on number 1? A, B, C, or D? All right, good. It looks like everyone's got that right. So B, she is going through menopause. So those are some of the common symptoms around the age that generally will go through menopause. So very good there. All right, number 2. I'll scroll up a little. Yeah, very good. Also on this one, the answer is also B. So generative. So generativity, we did focus on that a lot. I would be surprised if anyone got that one wrong. So there will be a couple more questions on generativity. So it's a good one to have there. All right, so let's look at number 3. This is one that more comes from your book than what we were talking about in class. So let's see if you remember this from your book. All right, I see a couple responses, and we also have a response with a question mark. So it suggests that maybe we're not quite sure on this one. But your answers are right. So the answer is D, early adulthood. So with this is early adulthood is a time in life when there is more potential for lots of changes, lifestyle changes, going to college, starting a first job, first serious partner, things like that. So this is oftentimes when a lot of changes happen in both identity as well as personality traits. We did talk about how personality traits might not be the best most predictive thing to look at, but how they can be really useful. So when we say personality traits, hopefully you're thinking of like the big 5 personality traits. So neuroticism, openness, conscientiousness, and I'm missing 2. So this is why notes are good. So it is open note, it is open book for the exam. Definitely one thing I would recommend as you're doing your studying is make your own page of notes or note card or something like that. So limit your notes that you have to like quickly glance at to a smaller piece, because that process of looking at your notes and being like, oh, I forgot all of the 5 personality traits in the big 5, then you writing them down, that process cognitively and writing it down, you'll remember writing it. That's generally a little bit better than typing it, though typing it is good too, just slight more benefits for actually writing it physically on a specific place in a piece of paper. Then when you go and take the test, you'll be more likely to remember that. But yes, early adulthood is when we generally see the most changes in like those big 5 personality traits. That being said, it can change earlier and later in life. Again, just on average, for most people, the most changes we're seeing happen in early adulthood. But that's not to say that they do not change later on. All right, so sandwich generation. Middle adulthood is the sandwich generation because A, B, C, or D. All right, we've got a couple responses for this. Oh, a bunch just came in actually. So great. Yes, the answer here is D. Middle adults may have to care for their own adolescent children as well as their elderly parents. So this is one thing that we generally don't talk about, is that this does add responsibilities onto middle adults. So that can add some stress. As we've talked about, stress is one of the well, that kind of gives away the next question, doesn't it? Stress is one of the biggest variables to extending life. So decreasing stress is one of the best things to do to increase life. That's not to say that to decrease stress, middle adults shouldn't care for their aging parents, just to do things to manage that stress in healthy ways. All right, so while I probably just gave away the answer to number 5, go for it. One of the factors that's contributed to the survival of centenarians, I have been saying it wrong. Centenarians is what? Yeah, very good. So the answer is A. So obviously, if there was B, a lack of stressful events in their lives, that probably would help them live longer. But generally, people have stresses in their lives. Even the centenarians that we talked about in Okinawa, there are still stresses, but they have community supports. They've developed their own ways to cope with the stress. So that coping with the stress, so A is definitely the correct answer there. So when we have stresses, learning how to manage those stresses will extend our lives. And if we can decrease stresses, that's great too, but it's not reasonable to expect a lack of all stressful events. All right, so let's jump to number 6. We talked about these when we were talking about aging and DNA and replication. Yeah, very good. So C, telomeres. So all of these things we didn't really talk about polymers, but these are all parts of cells and cells living, mitochondria, free radicals can also hurt the aging process. Well, free radicals can hurt the aging process. Mitochondria that aren't working as efficiently can make aging happen. But yes, the answer to this question is C. The DNA sequences that are just at the end, the extra DNA molecule that is there that we've evolved to be able to be chopped off to help us live longer are the telomeres. So very good, C. All right, let's see number 7. All right, I'm glad I put this one on here because this is definitely a trickier question because we did talk about all these different points. So let's ignore the question for a second and just read the responses. So successful aging depends on 3 main factors: selection, optimization, and compensation. We did talk about that in relation to physical health, that we need to select the things that we need to work on. We need to optimize certain things or compensate for certain losses. So we definitely did talk about that, but that is not activity theory. We also talked about how adults do become more selective about their social networks. So we talked about that in relation to socio-emotional development. Many adults, they narrow down their social networks, partially because of death and loss, partially because of focusing their energy on specific people that are the most meaningful relationships to them. So we definitely did talk about that. But again, that is not also activity theory. So we also talked about how older adults do the process of reflecting on the positive and negative aspects of their life, similar to identity development throughout life. They keep reflecting. They wonder, were they generative? We talked about that in relation to Erikson's research too. I forget what this last phase, is it ego integrity? It might be. Again, this would be a good place to go back and look at the notes, make sure you understand definitions of things, because if I'm getting that wrong, I'd go and look at those notes and double check. But the answer here is D. So again, we did talk about C. So activity theory is actually the idea that adults should continue trying to be active in their communities, doing tasks that they used to do. And one of the big key points is trying to maintain your middle adult roles all the way through the end of life and substituting anything you cannot. We tried to hit on that point. I'm not sure if we ever mentioned it specifically as activity theory, but your book definitely talks about it as activity theory. So we talked about all these points, but D is activity theory. So activity theory is the idea that you need to keep those roles, you need to keep being active, being involved in community, and then whatever roles you can't do. So if you can't, I'm thinking my own grandfather right now, one of his roles all through middle adulthood has been essentially to help all his neighbors take care of their yards and like handyman tasks around their house. Now he needs to substitute those for other roles. He can't do all of those things and compensate to still be engaged and supportive in his environment, but he's changed some aspects of that. So he's not going to be hauling out a big tree with his back now, for example. So that is activity theory. So really good. I'm glad that we have that question in here so we can make it clear. All right, so this is one thing and we talked about, maybe it was 2 classes ago for this class, in relation to the triarchic theory of love. So go for it. Number 8. Yep, very good. We've got C is the answer there. So A is couples who cohabit better, being in better health than health of married couples. No, both of them tend to be higher in health than single people in late adulthood. B, we do expect cohabiting of older adults to increase, and then the answer is C. They're cohabiting for companionship rather than love in most of the research. While we talked about it in class, we would probably call that companionship also love on that triarchic theory of love. So just making it clear that while we are also calling that companionship love, that's not what the original researchers were calling it. So the answer here is C. And it doesn't necessarily often result in marriage, although there is more remarriages in late adulthood than there have been previously. All right, let's do number 9. All right, good. I think hopefully the Kubler-Ross stages are already kind of in your mind, just because it's a commonly discussed thing, just in lay parlance. So hopefully you already have a good idea of these definitions. We talked about them a little bit today. But yeah, that is a really good example of C, denial and isolation. So with that, again, that is a fairly normal response. Another response that someone else might have hearing about a illness might be bargaining first thing, or depression first thing, or acceptance first thing. So these are all totally appropriate reactions to that kind of news and to grief. So hopefully I've gotten that point across here in these last couple classes. And hopefully some of the things that we reviewed today that we talked about in chapters 1 or 2, those are clearer now. Are there questions about the field of lifespan development or anything specifically in this study guide or in study guides 1, 2, or 3 that you wanted to cover before the end of class today?
Do you think it's gonna be more questions on the unit 1 or 2 or 3, so we can focus more on it?
That's a good question.
5 to 4?
There's definitely more questions on Unit 4, so about 70% of the questions are Unit 4, but I've tried to balance it out between the other units to be about equal. There might be, say, one question more on Unit 1 than Unit 2, or Unit 2 than Unit 3, but it's about equal. So I wouldn't, of 1, 2, and 3, I do know there's 1 or 2 questions more on Unit 1, so if you wanted to spend like an extra, I don't know, 15 minutes of the time you've budgeted for Unit 1 review, hopefully that helps answer your question. I've tried to make them equal, but I do know there's 1 or 2 more questions on Unit 1.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to go and look at the exam. I did finalize it, but I can't remember off the top of my head how many questions it is. So give me a second. Oh, also the final exam is 140 points, so that is more points than it has been in the past. I have cut it down to, it is 75 questions for Unit Exam 4. So Unit Exam 4, 75 questions. You have an hour and a half to complete it. Again, about 70% of these questions come from Unit 4, and then about 30 to 40% of the questions come from Units 1, 2, and 3. It's about equal between those, and it is open Monday and Tuesday, so do make sure that you set time to take that exam during those times. So yes, the signature assignment, I see some questions in the comments. So yes, the signature assignment is one assignment that you think really shows your work. So probably in this class, that will be your question paper, unless you did the extra credit where you wrote about early adult friendships, you might choose that. But yes, probably for most of you, I expect that your signature assignment will be one of your question papers that you think is the best. And yep, that just goes into your ePortfolio. You paste it on a page on your ePortfolio website. Also paste your reflection paper probably on that same page, and then give me so upload to Canvas. Here again, I'll go back to there really quickly. And so on Canvas, you will upload over here in Unit 4. You will upload your signature assignment again, even though you've submitted it for your question paper before. So you'll upload your signature assignment, upload your reflection paper, and put in the text entry box your link to your ePortfolio. And again, make sure those are set to public. The good question about, are they the same questions? Most of them are the same questions that you've either seen on the study guide or the exam. Some of them are just slightly different, but I think there might be 2 brand new questions, but almost everything you've seen before or a close variation before. So yeah, studying the previous exams is a really good way to prep for this. Yeah, and thank you all for being part of the class. I know it's very different to be in this kind of setting where we're talking through a computer and doing chat. So hopefully soon everyone can get vaccinated and we can be back in person. So good luck with that. Hopefully you don't have too many side effects when you do go and get vaccinated, but thank you for being a part of this class. So have a great rest of your day. Feel free to email me in between now and when you take the exam as well.
Thank you.